Newsroom at 8 o'clock. The head of the Met Police has apologised for failings over an unsolved murder after a scathing report accused the force of institutional corruption. Private detective Daniel Morgan was killed with an axe in a pub car park 34 years ago. Assistant Commissioner Nick F. Grave has told LBC the force isn't corrupt.
It's 34 years since Daniel Morgan was murdered in South London, and we have yet as an organisation failed to bring anyone to justice. And for that, I wish to apologise again to the family. I feel it very personally, and I know that others in this organisation that understand this investigation share that sentiment. I also recognise that failure has added to the pain and anguish that the family must have felt for all of those years.
First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says it's likely the next phase of easing Scotland's lockdown restrictions will be delayed. She expects to put off moving all parts of the country to level 0 for 3 weeks so more people can be vaccinated. Portugal have started the defence of their European Championship title with a 3-0 win over Hungary. The match was played in front of 60,000 fans in Budapest. To the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 25 points at 71.72. The pound buys $1.40 and €1.16. LBC weather: rain across western Scotland easing through the night. Scattered showers moving into northwest England. Largely dry with clear spells further south, a low of 10. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Zora Suleiman.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 1 minute past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Cross Question, LBC's thrice weekly political panel debate show. Joining me on the panel today are Jason Cowley, Editor-in-Chief of the New Statesman, Lord Peter Lilley, Conservative peer, former Cabinet Minister under Margaret Thatcher and John Major, Emma Hardy is Labour MP for Kingston upon Hull West and Hessel, former Shadow Universities Minister, and Dominique Samuels, political commentator, who I spy has been on the Red Bull this evening, so she's going to give us a bit of entertainment, I think. Right, we are going to get on with your first question in a moment, but let me just remind you that you can watch us on Global Player, on lbc.co.uk, on the LBC Facebook page and Twitter feed.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to Paul in Aldershot. Hello, Paul. What would you like to ask?
Good evening. I wanted to ask, is it fair that Cressida Dick receives so much criticism, given the fact the size of the organisation and the workload that she faces is absolutely enormous?
Broadly. We seem to have lost Paul. Right, Peter Lilley, what's your view on this?
Well, I haven't read the report since it came out. It seems odd that she should A, be subject to criticism about something that happened 34 years ago, and B, be apparently being less than helpful about opening up on what happened 34 years ago. It's a strange thing that people in all sorts of organisations put the reputation of their organisation at risk in trying to defend it. And it appears that was what she's done. But as I say, I've only got that second-hand from the report. Others may be better informed, in which case they may or may not correct me. But I wouldn't. I think she should be questioned as to why she's behaved like this, but she does attract a certain amount of flack, and it's easy to jump on and say, oh, she should resign over this, that and the other. She should be subject to criticism. She should answer for herself. But I'm puzzled as to why she apparently put the reputation of her organisation at risk by trying to defend it by being too defensive.
What about the broader question of the workload of managing an organisation as big as the Metropolitan Police? Inevitably, the buck stops with her. She is at the top of it. But she can't be held responsible for the actions of one or two errant officers, I suppose.
Well, if she's in charge of an organisation, she should be, and I'm sure she is, big enough to cope with those problems. Of course, she isn't responsible for everything that everyone did, still less what they did 34 years ago. I was responsible for 100,000 people at the DSS, and was held accountable in Parliament, even if one of them failed to give the correct benefits to someone. But you have to learn to cope with that. So I don't think that's an excuse she could rely on. Or it's all too big for me to cope with. It's too big for her to cope with. She shouldn't be there. I think she probably has got the capacity to cope with it. But I don't understand why she was less than helpful to this inquiry.
Emma Hardy.
Well, I think I kind of agree with Peter in the point that you have to hold somebody responsible, and she is in charge of the Met. But I do, and like Peter, I kind of find it slightly confusing that she wouldn't want to be as open and as transparent and as helpful as possible, because no one could hold her responsible for something that happened so many years ago. And therefore, you'd assume that she'd want to seem to be going over and above in terms of helping the inquiry. But in terms of the report, I haven't read all of the report, but the brief look I had at it, I think the concern we should be thinking about now is what are we going to do differently going forward? I think sometimes we can spend a lot of time looking at mistakes in the past and we miss out the important part of how are we going to learn from this and what are we going to do? What are we going to change? So I suppose the questions that I'd be wanting the government to answer right now is how can we ensure that the Met follow all of the recommendations that are in this report? How can we look at the change to make sure that these mistakes aren't repeated? We have a case in Humberside Police, which I won't go into now, but when we're looking at investigating historical cases, I think we do need to look at how they're done and making sure all the evidence is available at all times. And I think that's where we should be focusing at the moment.
Dominique Samuels, what's your view on this? And I mean, looking at the Daniel Morgan case in particular, can Cressida Dick be the right person to implement the recommendations of this report when she's criticised in it?
Well, I haven't actually read it, so I think I would generally agree. When you're the face of something as big as the Met, it makes sense for you to be generally held responsible for the things that go wrong. But then at the same time, I would have a bit of sympathy in the sense that, she obviously cannot be responsible for every single person that does something wrong. And in a sense, I feel that she's kind of an easy target at the moment. I mean, she had a lot of criticism, what with the Sarah Everard vigil and how that was policed. And I think at the moment she is facing a lot of criticism. So I'm not entirely surprised that she is mentioned in this report. But then again, I think it should be her responsibility to hold herself accountable and do what she can to make progress with the actual recommendations.
Jason Cowley, when you look at the fact that, 20 years ago or so, the Met Police were accused of being institutionally racist, they're now accused of being institutionally corrupt, it's a pretty sad state of affairs for an organisation to be in.
It is, Ian. If you think about it, when you lead an organisation as complex and as important as the Metropolitan Police, ultimately, as the leader, you are responsible. And then you have to use your judgment even in historical investigations. Now, this case goes back a long time. I'm old enough to vaguely remember it was the murder of a private detective, I think. A brutal murder, and then a long, slow investigation. And I don't think they ever got to the bottom of it. And I think that along the way, the Met was seen to delay and withhold access for the investigation. So it's very tough. You're right, though. It was denounced after the investigations into the terrible Stephen Lawrence murder and the Macpherson report. It was concluded that the Met was institutionally racist. This is at the end of the 90s. Now it's been called institutionally corrupt. It's challenging for Cressida Dick. When you lead an organisation, if you remember George Entwistle at the BBC in 2012, during the terrible Savile crisis, and then the false allegations that were made by BBC Newsnight against Lord McAlpine. George Entwistle, the Director General of the BBC, although he himself wasn't culpable, he resigned from his role as Director General of the BBC. And often when you lead a public-facing organisation and your organisation is seen to have failed in some way, some critical way, often the leader of that organisation, if that leader has decency and dignity and a sense of a belief in the common good, you resign. Now, I'm not sure what today's conclusion is a resigning issue for Cressida Dick, but it's very serious. It comes after the terrible murder of the young woman who was travelling home from Clapham Common. I don't need to go into the details of that case because of contempt of court, but we all know broadly what happened. We know what happened when many women turned up to rally that night in support of the victim. And I would suggest that Cressida Dick is going through a very, very difficult period.
Let's Paul, let's come back to you for a quick view from you. You asked the question about whether it's fair that she receives so much criticism. You clearly have some sympathy with her.
Yeah, I think I do, because I think, that she doesn't seem to get any support from AB and the mayor, who is supposed to oversee the organisation anyway. Given the size of that organisation, then she sits at the top, and anything that comes, from one way or another, she seems to face the flat over. And I do think there's a lot of other people that are ducking out of this, and she's carrying the can for.
As Jason pointed out, though, Paul, it's the same in any big organisation or even small organisation. If you are the person at the top, you are answerable for the actions of the entire organisation, and sometimes you have to take the consequences of that. Paul, thank you very much indeed. There's an allied question here on a text from Jackie in Hastings, who says this: BBC journalist Nick Watt had to flee from anti-lockdown protesters yesterday. Police can be seen on the video very clearly, but the Met are now claiming there was no one in the vicinity. Should those involved be prosecuted, and should there be a police inquiry? Well, I've seen that video, and it is quite clear there were lots of police around who did not intervene. I'm not sure they were asked to intervene. Dominique Samuels, and what do you think about this? Should there be an inquiry? Should people be prosecuted for chasing after a BBC journalist?
I mean, if that constitutes harassment or threatening behaviour, then, of course. And I think it was clear from the video that he was being chased and he was being treated very aggressively, and the police weren't really doing anything. I think you have to kind of look at whether or not they were really aware of what was actually going on. Did they know he was a journalist? Did they know that he was in distress or asking for help? I think there was obviously a lag with that from seeing the video. But I think my issue would be is some people on social media, particularly unsurprisingly, using, that video as an excuse to tarnish the reputation of anti-lockdown protesters. And obviously I do not condone the video, but that video doesn't represent, the majority of people who are anti-lockdown. And I think if anything, that video, which is obviously not a good look, does represent that there is a growing frustration in this country with the persistence of lockdown measures.
But it's the same on any protest, isn't it? There'll be a few people, it's like the Black Lives Matter protest last June, where the overwhelming number of people were peaceful, but at the end of it there was violence. Now, there wasn't actual violence here. I think there were certainly threats, or Nick Watt certainly felt under threat. Peter Lilley, I imagine in your life in politics you've had one or two incidents where you felt fairly unsafe at the hands of protesters?
Yes, actually. I remember finding my way through a crowd of about 3,000 people demonstrating during the miners' strike outside the Conservative Party conference, and waving banners and hoping I wouldn't be noticed. One did notice me, and I was foolish enough to stop and engage in argument. Then I felt my wife thumping me on the back and trying to get me out of it. And I said, "All right, darling, I'll be with you in a minute." Looked round and found I was actually one of the demonstrators thumping me on the back with his placard. But he was
says a lot about your wife.
Yes. Well, she is a strong-willed woman. But he was so shocked by being called darling by me that he desisted. I was able to get out of the crowd. I've been very lucky. I haven't suffered. I've suffered threats, but I've never suffered physical abuse beyond that.
Have you seen this video?
No, I haven't. But normally I wouldn't be sympathetic to anybody on Newsnight, but the one person on Newsnight I'm sympathetic with, even if he's only being shouted at from a distance, is Nick Watt, who's actually the best thing on Newsnight.
Jason Cowley, obviously, as a journalist, you'll have a lot of sympathy with Nick Watt here, but frankly, it doesn't matter whether he's a journalist or indeed anybody else. This should not happen, should it?
Absolutely agree. I've seen the video. It was very menacing, very disturbing, actually. No one actually punches him. One guy sort of jostles him. You can see that Nick is deeply alarmed. Police are quite close by, actually. No attempt to intervene. Obviously, one supports the right to peaceful protest. What I take from it, though, is something slightly different from an attempt to tarnish anti-lockdown protesters. What worries me increasingly is the attack on journalists going about their business. Nick is a reporter. He's not a commentator. He's a political editor. He's an independent reporter. He's his own politics. I couldn't predict what they were. He's sceptical in his approach. He asks difficult questions, and he's a reporter. He's trying to find the truth and explain it and tell stories about what's going on. Now, increasingly, and not necessarily in this country, but in this country, but also beyond these shores, journalists are under threat. They're being menaced by state power, other institutions. I went to Romania with Jeremy Hunt when he was Foreign Secretary to report on a trip, and one of Jeremy's particular interests was press freedom. And I was at a round table of Romanian journalists, and Romania's in the EU. At which we listened to their stories of how the state, former communist country, but now nominally a democracy or a democracy, is putting increasing pressure on journalists, stopping them doing their job, stopping them going about their business, stopping them reporting freely. And this is a deeply disturbing trend. And not so long ago, we had the President of the United States, who was determined, in effect, to declare war on mainstream publications. The New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, CNN. He dismissed them as fake news because he didn't like what they were reporting and what they were saying. And what we saw happen to Nick today is part of that hostile culture directed at journalists. And I don't care what their politics are, right, left, centrist, Remainers, Brexiteers. What I don't like is seeing reporters going about their business being menaced in the way that Nick Watt today was menaced, or yesterday, and the police simply standing by observing.
Dominic, you were laughing and shaking your head at what Jason was saying about Donald Trump there. It's surely an incontrovertible fact that he did make things very difficult for legitimate journalists.
Unequivocally true.
I mean, at the same time, he was always being questioned by journalists. The same can't actually be said for Joe Biden, who regularly won't go near journalists. And secondly, in terms of, the whole thing about fake news, yes, I understand that there was, kind of a cultivation of hostility towards journalists. But I think it's also an indisputable fact that in America, platforms like CNN and the New York Post were just objectively biased against Donald Trump. You do not see the same level of critique towards Joe Biden that you did towards Donald Trump. I think even the New York Post took down their fact-checking section that was reserved for Donald Trump, and now it's mysteriously disappeared. Now Joe Biden is president. So I think there are two sides to this.
Maybe it's because he just doesn't lie like Donald Trump did.
Oh, come on. Joe Biden doesn't lie like Donald Trump did. I mean, all politicians, play with the truth and lie about things. And if you really are about objective fact-checking, then you wouldn't remove it just because someone you like is president. That's not objective journalism.
You surely can't be comfortable to see a journalist going about his business being menaced in the way that Nick was, surely.
Well, no, I mean, I've said multiple times that I don't think it was the right thing to do. But I think where I'm coming from is I do think that a lot of people are frustrated with a growing level of bias that seems to be within the media at the moment, which is why there's such an appetite for platforms.
There's always bias in media. If you're a free press, you have different political points of view and you argue them in a free and fair way. That's what happens in democracies. I mean, that's what democracy is about. Yeah. No one's arguing for fixed opinions.
No,
I'm not anti-bias. Bias is fine by me.
No, I would completely agree with that. But the overwhelming direction of that opinion seems to be towards the left. And I just have to be honest about that. And
what opinion are you talking about that's towards the left?
Can I just finish, please? That's why there's such an appetite for platforms like GB News, who surpassed the BBC in viewing figures recently. That's why there's such an appetite for it. I'm not saying that warrants hostility and violence towards journalists, but you can't pretend that, you don't understand why people are getting sick of journalists.
I think what you meant to say was there's such an appetite for LBC, but
I'm going to defend you. I'm going to defend you.
Okay, Emma Hardy.
I defend journalists of whatever political position they are. I defend the free press.
Emma.
Well, obviously I've seen the video of Nick Watt. I put something out on Twitter about it. I thought it was absolutely appalling. I think it's fantastic in our country that we have the right to free speech, we have the right to protest, but those rights carry with them a level of responsibility, and the right to, there's no right to intimidate, to bully, to be aggressive. And in fact, I say this, and I've said this not just as a politician, but as a primary teacher for the 11 years beforehand. It is perfectly possible to disagree without being disagreeable. And since becoming a member of Parliament, I've formed the Oversea All-Party Parliamentary Group with that sole aim, improving the debate and discussion that is had within our education system. Of course, there has always been, looking at news, there's been bias. There's bias all the time. You look at the different newspapers, of course they have a political slant. I mean, it's amusing sometimes, especially when you look at the reaction to the G7, to see each different newspaper take its own political, reaction to it. And indeed to GB News, when you look at the reaction from the different papers that are out there and how they wrote up the first night of GB News. But that's fine. That's democracy. That's having different views. That's publishing those different views. That's disagreeing in a way that is a pillar of our democracy. We do not need to be in a position where we try and silence other people. And I do have to say, I find it just a little bit amusing that some of the people who claim to be silenced are those we've seen the most of on our news and publication and through social media recently. So for being silenced, they do seem to be rather public at the moment. So I think if we're going to talk about how do we debate well as a democracy? How do we disagree in a fair way? How do we act in a respectful manner to each other and show that while we might have different opinions, we respect the fact that somebody else has them and they have a right to give them as well. But I think this idea that, I'd love all the mainstream media to be on the left and giving the Labour Party a really great time. That would be wonderful. I can't wait for that day to happen. But I sincerely promise it is not happening right now.
Well, I don't know, at the end of our news hour, as an impartial news broadcaster, I said to Barry Gardner, I obviously can't give an opinion on your fire and rehire campaign, but I fully support it. Now, if I was on the BBC, obviously I'd get sacked for that, but there we go. Right, I'm going to call this to an end. It's 22 minutes past 8. Do keep your calls coming, 0345 6060 973.
This is LBC. Hello. Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:24 on LBC. We have with us Jason Cowley, Editor-in-Chief of the New Statesman, Lord Lilley, Peter Lilley, Conservative peer and former Cabinet Minister, Emma Hardy, Labour MP for Kingston upon Hull West and Hessel, and former Shadow Universities Minister, and the political commentator Dominique Samuels. Right, let's go to our next question. It's from Claire in Edgware. Hello, Claire.
Yeah, good evening, panel. We signed a trade deal with Australia today, and according to the BBC 1 o'clock news, that contributes 0.02% to our economy over the next 15 years, which represents about £1 per UK household. And so far, again, according to reports, Brexit has cost us $200 billion. Will we ever have any hope of recouping the millions that we've lost as a result of Brexit and walking away from a market of 500 million people?
Dominique Samuels.
Do you know, I just find this conversation, really tiresome now. I think we do have to get over the fact that we did leave the European Union. And I think the Australia deal, yes, it may be small in terms of the benefits it gives per household. But I do think there are some benefits. Say, for example, for younger people, it makes it easier for us to go and live and work in Australia. It makes, exporting things like Scotch whisky to Australia easier. And I think not just on the basis of kind of the material positive that it has, but it does also signal that the UK is able to go out and forge trade deals with other partners. I mean, we wouldn't have got this kind of deal with Australia had we have been in the EU. So I think we do have to, kind of be positive about things like this. Get over the fact that we've moved on and just recognise that we are moving on and forging relationships with other partners across the world. And also the fact that with Australia, securing this trade deal will also mean that we're able to access other markets further seas. So there are benefits to this, and it will take some time. We were a part of the EU for such a long time. Obviously, it will take time to recover. It's not going to be like a 2-year thing.
Jason.
Good old Aussies, eh? Our old friends from. We play cricket with them, so why not have a trade deal? I mean, it's not going to amount to much, but it's a start, isn't it? It's a post-Brexit start, and it's symbolic. It's the first trade deal. I can't get particularly agitated about it either way. I might if I was a sheep farmer, or I farmed cattle in Scotland. I might get a little bit more worried about the arrival of, what is it? Australia, I think, is the second largest exporter of beef in the world after Brazil. Huge country, huge mechanized farming practices. I might be more concerned if I was a farmer. But again, I heard your conversation with Barry Gardner, Iain, just before the programme began, and you were talking about 15-year introduction periods. But it's symbolic. We can't refight the Brexit wars. Boris Johnson went into the 2019 general election on a manifesto to get Brexit done. The Liberal Democrats had a manifesto to revoke the 2016 referendum result, and they were routed. And indeed, their leader even lost her parliamentary seat. And the Labour Party in 2019 went into that election offering a second referendum and went down to their worst defeat since 1935. I voted for Remain. I was always a sceptical Remainer, but I voted to remain. Now, I was sorry the United Kingdom left the European Union, but the United Kingdom has left the European Union. That has been an opportunity was taken in 2019 to reverse that decision. The electorate chose not to. Where the complications arise for the Brexiteers as they push on into this brave new future of so-called global Britain is the United Kingdom itself. Now, Brexit has a chance of succeeding if the UK holds together. But two constituent parts of the United Kingdom, Scotland and Northern Ireland, voted Remain. The union is fragile, probably as fragile as I've known it. A nationalist movement is in power in Scotland, the SNP, won another resounding victory at the Scottish Parliament elections. We are already witnessing what Brexit is doing to the stability of Northern Ireland. And you saw behind the scenes at the G7 summit in Cornwall, the tensions between Johnson, Ursula von der Leyen of the EU, Macron and Merkel of Germany. So there are real tensions over that Northern Ireland Protocol. So this first trade deal with Australia, it's a start. It's symbolic. Brexit, it's too early to work out whether Brexit is going to be a successful failure. A lot of people, ardent Remainers, will always consider it a failure. They won't want it in any way to succeed because they identified as Europeans. They wanted to be part of that European Union. More than half of the population did not, certainly in England. But the real challenges lie ahead is holding the United Kingdom together, I think.
OK. Right, we'll get the answers from our two politicians in just a moment, but do keep your calls coming with your questions. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:30 on LBC. Zora Suleiman has the news headlines.
The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Dame Cressida Dick, has apologised for failings in an unsolved murder case after an independent report accused the force of institutional corruption. Private Detective Daniel Morgan was killed in 1987 and no one has been convicted despite 5 police inquiries. The report found major failings which spanned decades. The UK has signed a post-Brexit trade deal with Australia. The agreement should make favourites like Australian wine and Tim Tam biscuits slightly cheaper. However, there's concern from British farmers about imports of cheap meat. And the ex-wife of Amazon founder Jeff Bezos has donated $2.7 billion to charity. Mackenzie Scott is one of the world's richest women. The money will be shared among 286 organisations working on racial inequality, the arts and education. LBC weather: rain in western Scotland easing through the night, scattered showers for northwest England and largely dry and clear across the south, a low of 10 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:33, you're listening to LBC's Cross Question with Jason Cowley, Editor-in-Chief of the New Statesman, Lord Peter Lilley, Conservative peer, former Cabinet Minister, Emma Hardy, Labour MP for Kingston upon Hull West and Hessel, and former Shadow Universities Minister, and the political commentator Dominique Samuels. Well, Claire in Edgware asked the question, we just signed a trade deal with Australia that contributes £1 per family. Are we ever going to be able to financially recoup the money we lost by leaving the EU? Emma Hardy.
Well, I think Jason's right in that we had a general election which solves, or put to bed the question of Brexit once and for all. And as Jason said, if people had wanted another referendum, then we would be the party in government right now, and we're not. So I think it is about what do we do next and how well do we do it moving moving forward. And I think the problem with the Australian deal is similar to the promises made during fishing. It's the over-promising, under-delivering. Now, the area where I'm from, Hull, has been a proud fishing area, and I've recently been talking about the impact on distant fleet water fishing. They were promised a lot by the Brexit campaign. They were promised a lot by the Conservative government. They were promised the heady days of returning to, the fishing industry that once was. And what we've had instead is the failure to secure a deal with Norway, is distant fleet fishing ending for good for England, and the last of the distant fleet fishing boats being moored up and not able to go out again.
I thought we had agreed a deal with Norway now.
We've agreed, makes it even worse, Ian. We agreed a trade deal with Norway that didn't give us access to the fishing waters. And the thing that's really angered local people is pre-EU, we had access to these fishing waters. During the EU, we had access to them because we had the European Union's quota to fish in that area, because lots of people there wasn't as much of a demand for cod and haddock and the fish that you get out there. And so post-EU is the only time in which we've not had access to those waters. And to really sort of put the sting in it, which was made it especially hard to swallow locally, was Liz Truss tried to sell it as, this is great, we can import more fish from Norway and there's more fish processing jobs in our area. Well, if you're a fisherman and your trade is working out at sea, and you're a proud fisherman from a long line of fishermen, and you have that heritage, you live in that area and it forms part of your identity, being told that, oh, don't worry, you can work in the fish processing factory instead, because look, we're making more jobs there, is hardly a fair trade-off. And it feels a bit like that with the Australian deal. I mean, the only reason we know much about it is because the Australians seem to have published the details. We haven't really seen the details. And if we talk back about Brexit and the taking back control, it's taking back control and giving it to who? Because it seems to be going directly to the government, certainly not to Parliament, as we've seen this week with the contempt in which the government held Parliament by refusing to give any announcements to them, and the rebuttal that we just saw from the Speaker. But if we really want to give control back to more people, and why wouldn't we? We should be having that deal with Australia scrutinised, voted on, interrogated in Parliament, and lots of these questions answered along the lines of, OK, so if this is going to impact farmers in our country, then what are we going to do to mitigate that? What are the changes that we, as a constituency MP, these are the things your constituents are asking you, these are the questions you should be able to ask. But instead, we've got a poor deal to increase jobs in fish processing, which is all very well. It's not as good as working on the boats to begin with, though, is it? And then we've got a deal with Australia that potentially puts our food security as a nation at risk, because if we have our farmers suddenly shut up shop, then that's going to have an impact there. So, I kind of think, well, It's better than nothing, but not much better.
Peter Lilley, better than nothing, but not much better.
Well, for a moment, I was pleased that everybody was following Dominique's point that it's tiresome to go over the old Brexit debates. Then, having all agreed that, two of our commentators did sort of go rather back over that sort of thing. One of the reasons the Brexit debate is tiresome to repeat is that a mistake both sides made during the Brexit debate was assuming that trade deals are what drives trade. Trade deals are useful, but they're much less important than people imagine. The question is quite right. There won't be a huge growth of trade just because of this trade deal with Australia, but it's a good thing. She's wrong in supposing that our membership of the single market was a huge driver of trade. I was the Secretary of State who had to introduce the whole single market programme. And like everybody else, I thought it would have a wonderful boost to our export. And I made bullish speeches saying how vastly our exports would expand. 25 years later, they'd grown by less than 0.5% a year, less than the growth of the GDP of the countries we'd signed that deal with. Meanwhile, of the 14 biggest countries we traded with outside any trade deal on WTO terms, our exports had grown by 78%. Now, it doesn't mean to say you don't want trade deals. It means that what drives trade is producing goods and services and selling them to growing and prosperous markets. Australia is an important market in itself. Our trade will be eased by reduction in or the elimination of tariffs on cars and on whiskey and things like that. But that's comparatively small beer. Of more importance is the fact that this is our entry route to the Trans-Pacific Trade and whatever it is, TPTTP or TTPP, I can never remember how many T's and P's there are in the Pacific Agreement, which is one of the biggest trading blocs in the world and fast growing. Now, even that won't be the solution to all our problems. The only solution to the trading, or the only way to be sure to be prosperous, is produce goods and services other people want to buy, get out and sell them, preferably aided by a competitive exchange rate. Have trade deals? Yes. Glad to see Liz Truss is launching more trade deals. They'll all be modestly useful, but let's not imagine that our success comes from trade deals. It comes from making goods and services people want to buy.
So to Claire's question, are we ever going to be able to financially recoup the money we've lost by leaving the EU? What's your answer?
We haven't lost money by leaving the EU. In the long run, we saved £10 billion a year, which was the net contribution we made.
But the economists will say that our GDP is reduced by X% each year because we're no longer members of the EU, so that has cost the economy.
No, some would say that, but I had long disputes with the head of the economic section of the Treasury, and he agreed that a lot of their forecasts and that were rubbish, and he went on, left the Treasury and now works elsewhere. No, we haven't cut off our trade to Europe. Europe is going to make things difficult for us for a while because their priority is not economic prosperity. It's making sure that other people don't follow our example and leave the European Union. And for that reason, there was never any prospect of them giving us a win-win deal. It had, from their point of view, to appear to be a win-lose deal. It had to appear that we were losing something. But in the long run, they will come around and we will trade and prosper. In the meantime, we will continue to trade and prosper if our people get out and sell goods that they want.
OK. Claire, very quickly, I imagine you're probably slightly unhappy about the answers you've had.
Yeah, the answers, quite frankly, were pathetic. I'm not being disrespectful.
Very generous of Claire, very generous.
And that's not regard to the majority of the panellists. That's primarily the Tory MP. My son is based in Barcelona.
There isn't one of them, but hey.
And the Europeans love British products. They go crazy. One of my son's friends owns a shop and sells nothing but British products, and it's all being bought by Spaniards. My question was, can we ever recoup the 200 billion we've lost by walking away from a market of 500 million? If the answer is no, Iain, then we're big enough and ugly enough and brave enough to take it on the chin. No, there's no chance of that. But be honest with us. Tell us the truth.
I'll be honest with you. I'll be honest with you and tell you the truth. We haven't walked away from a market of 500 million people. We still trade with that market of 500 million people. So you're starting from the wrong premise almost.
Well, I can't see how a trade... I mean, and this chap, is it Lord Lilley? Is that his name? He's saying that... that we don't need trade deals. Before all this Brexit thing exploded, we were told the most important thing was trade deals. This is the thing you hear on LBC so often. We've never been told the truth. We were told that we would leave the
Claire, with respect, if you say that we're broadcasting misinformation, you've just broadcast misinformation by saying that we're walking away from a market of 500 million. We're absolutely not. Peter Lilley, you wanted to come back on Claire there.
Yes, I mean, I said what I'm saying now during the course of the debate, and it's quite high profile. I was a former trade minister, and it was widely reported, and certainly in every debate that I attended, and I used to do 2 a day during the referendum campaign, I would say, don't exaggerate the importance of trade deals. They're useful. Better to have them than not. But as you say, we haven't walked away from the EU market, and it's highly contentious to say we've lost this mythical £200 billion.
OK, well, Claire, thank you very much for that. Stand by your beds, because in a couple of minutes we have a question from Sean in Concert. It's coming up to 8:45.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast, LBC.
His address at the funeral of his sister still makes the spine tingle.
But of all the ironies about Diana, perhaps the greatest was this: a girl given the name of the ancient goddess of hunting, was, in the end, the most hunted person of the modern age.
Since then, he's also responded to the disgraceful job sprung on his sister by the BBC.
Diana did lose trust in really key people. When she died, she was without any form of real protection.
Now, Charles Spencer is a best-selling historical author, and he joins me, Nick Ferrari, Thursday morning from 7.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast, weekday mornings from 7. Listen live on Global Player, LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 8:47 on LBC. You're listening to Cross Question, or watching Cross Question. We have Jason Cowley, Peter Lilley, Emma Hardy and Dominique Samuels with us. Let's go to Sean in Consett for the next question. Sean, fire away.
Hello,
Hi.
Ian. Hello, panel. Can you tell me, is this government really lost the plot now because of this social distancing, right? You had a barbecue for Tories, right? And all the G7, right? You had the cricket, you had the football, and now you had Royal Ascot, right? Drinking champagne, no social distancing. Why is people getting penalised at weddings and funerals for having no social distancing?
That's a very
joke, man. It's getting beyond the joke. This government is round the twist.
I mean, this is an interesting one, isn't it? Because, of course, it was also announced that there's going to be a full attendance at the finals of Wimbledon this year. And you think, well, hang on a minute, how can that possibly be the case when you have at Wembley 20,000 people, all social distancing? You can't possibly social distance on the centre court at Wimbledon if you have a full allocation of people. There are many inconsistencies here, aren't there, Jason Cowley?
Well, there certainly are inconsistencies, which is why our friend from the northeast was so agitated. He said the government's round a twist. I wouldn't quite say that, but it is the inconsistencies, Ian, which I think are upsetting people and irritating people. Particularly, one of Boris Johnson's skills, you could say, his failures is to overpromise, and then he invariably has to let people down. I mean, this whole talk about Freedom Day, when we would be liberated from lockdown, and then inevitably the government's own failures to control incoming flights from India during April has resulted in this spread of the Delta variant, which originated in India. Very, very disturbing spread. It would have come to the UK anyway, but what happened in April was accelerated its arrival and its spread, which is then, as it has had a consequence, because Johnson also listens to the scientists and the medics around him who are advising him, and he's had to reverse once again, and it's upset people, and they see inconsistencies everywhere. I didn't know about Centre Court at Wimbledon. You can't socially distance there unless you're in the Royal Box here, and where no doubt you will be. Wembley
Chance would be a fine thing.
Well, I hope they're listening to this. They'll invite you. 20,000 people at Wimbledon. People can't, limited number of people at funerals and other social occasions. I do think people are getting confused, they're getting frustrated, and they're upset.
The times I've been to Wimbledon, I used to sleep on the pavement outside, I'll have you know. Emma Hardy.
Yeah, don't worry, that's going to change this year, I'm sure.
I agree. It is the inconsistency of message and just so frustrating. I think the overwhelming feeling I get from people, certainly up here in Hull, is that people are fed up. They've had enough now. This has been going on, for a really long time. They were promised there would be these freedoms on the 21st of June, and it's been pulled away at the last minute. As Jason said, after being built up and built up and built up, to have that taken away is such a kick in the teeth. And I've been hearing from a local guy who's a DJ bloke who's getting involved unbelievably in sort of turning around a local shopping centre and putting a club into the basement of a shopping centre in Hull, which you can definitely come to, Ian, when we have that night up here. But he was saying to me how upset he's been with the nighttime industry and the nightclubbing industry. We've had no support. And again, it's that inconsistency, and you can see why he's so angry. Yes, you can go to Centre Court and you can watch tennis. Now more people can go to weddings. You can go to, watching matches, but you can't go to a nightclub and have a dance on an evening because that's inconsistent with the rules. And it does feel like the government are picking and choosing, if I'm being honest, the sort of leisure pursuits that maybe they enjoy more than others. So perhaps we need to
perish the thought. Emma, what a terrible thing to say.
We need to get the government clubbing. That's what we need to do, and then maybe they'll be interested in the nighttime economy.
Michael Gove in Ibiza with his shirt off. That's what you want, isn't it?
Well, as I've just said, in a basement club at a shopping centre in Hull, that's where they all need to be. But this frustration and this anger, I think, has been made worse by the delay with the borders. And the frustrating thing is that nobody, in this case, no one can accuse the Labour Party of not having mentioned this. I think we've mentioned it repeatedly from January and February. And in fact, we produced today a dossier of all the number of times we've said, close the borders, sort out quarantine, close the borders, sort out quarantine.
Okay.
Even, went there and made the point and did a video on it. So it's not they weren't told, they just chose not to listen to it. And I honestly don't understand why.
I'm going to ask for brief answers from Peter and Dominic, because then we can squeeze in another question. Peter first.
Well, I agree with Emma, and it's wonderful to know that she's going to rebel against her front bench, as I should probably rebel against mine. The only reason for this delay is for more people to have their second jab. There's absolutely no reason for preventing the 30 million people who already had their second jab or are too young to have to worry about the potentially fatal effects of COVID, because it won't do them serious and lasting harm, is to allow there's no justification for stopping them getting out and enjoying themselves. And it's not just the inconsistencies, there is no reason for doing this. They should just say to the 30 million people, or to the 10 million people who've had their first jab and not the second, you've got a lot of protection from your first jab. If you want to get absolutely the maximum protection, be very cautious for the next 4 weeks or so until you've had your second jab. Meanwhile, everybody else go out and enjoy themselves and carry on. We've got to get back to relying on people's personal responsibility, common sense, and not trying to micromanage every aspect of their lives.
Okay, Dominic?
I think there will be endless inconsistencies, because when you exert so much control over people's lives, it's very likely that those in power won't stick to the rules they put in place. And I think, with the delay, There are a lot of questions around it that don't make sense to me. First being that a lot of the data that this was based upon was, quite frankly, the predictions were just incorrect. I mean, The Telegraph did an article recently looking deeper at the figures. And according to the 9th of June model done by Warwick, they predicted around this time that hospital admissions would be 2,257. The actual number is 1,501. If you look at the AstraZeneca vaccine and the protection that it gives you against the Delta variant, it's 71% and then 92% for the second dose. And I could go on forever, but I know this has to be short. But what I'm trying to say is that the data this was based on was out of date and were really over-predicted, even discounting the arrival of a new variant. So this decision, to me, just really does not make sense. It just seems like an inconsistency in itself. And also, once we get into autumn and winter territory, who's to say that there won't be another cry for restrictions once we're in that territory when cases will inevitably rise again? I think we need to learn to live with the virus. We're in a really good place now where it's starting to become endemic. 8 in 10 adults in the UK have antibodies. Let's move on.
OK. Sean, I'm going to move on because I think we know what you think, judging from the way you put your question. Thank you very much indeed. Judith in Thrapston has asked a question on a text. The Guardian is reporting that vaccines are set to be made compulsory for care home staff. Is this fair or right? Now, we've got 4 minutes, so that's 60 seconds each. Emma Hardy, go.
I'm not convinced by making it compulsory. I mean, I've had the vaccine. I support the vaccine. I'd encourage everybody to go and have the vaccine. But I think forcing people, I don't think is the best way to go on this. I would much prefer to encourage, to persuade, to convince, to show the evidence to, all of these measures before we go down making something compulsory. A mandatory part of their job would be the way I'd do it.
Admirably brief, which gives Jason a few more seconds.
Yes, persuade, cajole, encourage people to have the vaccine. I don't think we can force them through the law. To do so, it might violate religious beliefs. It might violate certain convictions. I have no idea why you wouldn't listen to the scientists and to be vaccinated. Actually, I have ideas, but I understand why some people wouldn't. But you can't force people to be vaccinated. No.
Do you think, though, that maybe care home owners should be allowed to say, well, if you don't have a vaccine, you ain't working for me?
That's a different question, and I'd need to think more about it than a 10-second answer. But that may be a consequence of refusing the vaccine.
Dominique?
I'm obviously of the belief that the individual is sovereign and nobody should be forced to undergo a medical procedure that they don't want. There are various reasons why people might not want to get the vaccine, and some of the concerns around the vaccine, I don't believe just complete conspiracy theories, just looking at some of the countries that have particular concerns about AstraZeneca, for example. I think the role of the whole thing about saying that, well, you can't work for me if you don't do this, I disagree with that, because that in itself is coercing people to do something that you want to do, that you want them to do. I don't think...
Yeah, but there is a reason for it, isn't there? There is a reason, and the reason is because you're more likely to infect the people that are paying £1,000 a week to be cared for.
Yeah, but of course, but even then, the vaccine in itself isn't 100% effective when it comes to transmission anyway. I mean, Sage said the people that would be hospitalised would actually be double dosed because of their own immunisation failures. They'd be more at risk to that than they would an unvaccinated person. And that's scientists that have actually said that. So this idea that we should start barring people from society because they don't want to undergo a certain medical procedure, I think it's a completely immoral injustice.
Have you had the vaccine? Are you going to have the vaccine?
I think that, that's my personal information. That's my personal choice. The reason I'm saying that is not because...
You're sounding like Jeremy Corbyn now.
No, it's not because I actually agree with his sentiment. It's not because I'm an anti-vax, pro-vax, whatever. I've actually been vaccinated before. The reason is I'm not feeding into this culture of people trying to validate their opinion by saying they've been vaccinated, which then leads to demonising people who haven't. I'm just not engaging in it.
Peter?
The government shouldn't require people to have the vaccine in order to work in certain places, but it's perfectly reasonable for the owner or manager of a care home to say, if you want to work here, then you've got to have the vaccine because I want to offer that level of security to the people who come in here. and it will be up to people to make their choice where they work in those circumstances. But it's they have a freedom, the owners and managers of those homes and the people resident in them, just as other people do. But it's not what we've got to get away from is the idea that the government has to lay down whether people can and cannot do things the whole time. It's taken on huge powers, and it's time it gave them back.
I rather wish we'd come to this question a bit earlier, because I think that it's actually quite an interesting ethical and moral question here rather than just a political one. Maybe we should have a few more ethical questions on future editions of Cross Question. Tomorrow, let me tell you, we have the head of Liberty, Gracie May Bradley, with us, Charlie Mullins from Pimlico Plumbers, Angus MacNeil, the SNP MP, and the former Conservative Health Minister, Edwina Currie. So that should be a bit of a spicy one. Thank you all four of you for joining us this evening. Jason Cowley, Peter Lilley, Emma Hardy and Dominique Samuels. Look forward to welcoming you back into the studio. Won't be quite as quickly as we thought, but there we go. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the Commissioner of the Met Police, Dame Cressida, has apologised for failings in an unsolved murder case after an